Paris 1789. Inside a crowded coffeehouse called the Café de Foy, a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins climbs onto a table, a pistol in each hand. He has just heard that the king's finance minister has been dismissed. He is shouting to the crowd around him. Within hours, that crowd will storm the Bastille. Historians will later call this the spark that ignited the French Revolution, and it did not happen in a palace or a parliament or a battlefield. It happened over cups of coffee. That was 1789, but the story does not start there. So how did a small red berry from an African mountainside end up toppling monarchies, fueling empires, and reshaping the modern economy? To answer that, we have to go back more than 1,000 years to a highland forest in East Africa, long before anyone had ever written the word coffee down. According to legend passed down for generations, a goat herder in Ethiopia named Kaldi noticed his goats becoming unusually energetic after eating the red berries of a certain shrub. Curious, he tried them himself and felt the same jolt of alertness. Whether or not Kaldi himself ever existed, the plant was real, and it grew wild across the highlands of what is now Ethiopia. Local communities chewed the berries whole, mixed them with animal fat for energy on long journeys, and eventually began brewing the roasted seeds into a dark, bitter drink. The taste was sharp, the effect was electric, and slowly this obscure regional habit began to travel. By the 15th century, coffee had crossed the Red Sea into Yemen, where Sufi monks began drinking it to stay awake during long nights of prayer. From the port city of Mocha, the seed spread into the wider Islamic world. Think about that for a second. A drink first used to keep monks awake for worship would, within a few centuries, be used to keep revolutionaries awake for war. By the 1500s, coffeehouses called cafés had opened across Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and Istanbul. These were not quiet cafés. They were loud, crowded rooms where men gathered to talk politics, play chess, listen to music, and gossip about the Sultan. Religious authorities grew nervous. In the Ottoman Empire, coffeehouses were banned more than once, precisely because rulers feared what happens when ordinary people gather in one place and start talking freely. Coffee, from its very first century of popularity, was already tangled up with rebellion. By 1600, coffee had reached Venice through Ottoman trade routes, and from there it spilled into the rest of Europe. In 1652, the first coffeehouse in London opened its doors. Within a few decades, London alone had more than 2,000 of them. People began calling them penny universities, because for the price of a single cup a person could sit for hours, read a newspaper, and debate anything from science to scripture with total strangers. Merchants met there to trade. In fact, one particular London coffeehouse, owned by a man named Edward Lloyd, became so popular with sailors and shipowners discussing insurance that it eventually grew into Lloyd's of London, still one of the largest insurance markets on Earth today. But behind every cup brewed in London or Paris was a much darker story taking shape an ocean away. As demand for coffee exploded across Europe, colonial powers realized this was not just a drink, it was a fortune. In the early 1700s, the Dutch smuggled coffee plants to their colonies in Java, and the French brought a single seedling across the Atlantic to the island of Martinique. From that seedling, an entire hemisphere of coffee plantations was born, particularly in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. Here is the part that most people never learn about. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue alone was producing roughly half the world's coffee supply. That production was built entirely on the backs of enslaved Africans, worked under brutal conditions on plantations designed for maximum yield at minimum human cost. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of enslaved people died on Saint-Domingue's coffee and sugar plantations combined. The elegant coffeehouses of Paris, filled with philosophers debating liberty and equality, were pouring cups filled by the labor of people who had neither. That contradiction did not go unnoticed forever. In 1791, enslaved workers in Saint-Domingue rose up in what became the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history to result in an independent nation. The very commodity that had enriched French colonists became one of the forces that helped end French colonial rule on the island. Meanwhile, back in Europe, coffeehouses were becoming incubators for revolution in a very different way. In pre-revolutionary Paris, cafés like the Café de Foy and the Café Procope were among the few public spaces where people of different classes could sit together and speak somewhat freely. Voltaire reportedly spent hours at the Café Procope. Enlightenment ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of man were debated over coffee long before they were shouted in the streets. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. When Camille Desmoulins jumped onto that café table in July 1789, he was doing something coffeehouses had trained an entire generation to do: gather, argue, and act. 2 days later, the Bastille fell. If you are finding this story interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. France was not alone. Across the Atlantic, American colonists boycotting British tea after the Boston Tea Party in 1773 needed something else to drink, and many turned to coffee instead, partly as a political statement against British goods. Drinking coffee instead of tea became, quite literally, an act of protest. To this day, the United States remains one of the largest coffee-consuming nations on Earth, a habit with roots in an 18th-century boycott. By the 19th century, coffee was no longer just a revolutionary drink. It was becoming a global industry. Brazil emerged as the new center of coffee production, again built largely on enslaved labor until abolition in 1888, after which plantation owners shifted to poorly paid immigrant workers instead. By 1900, Brazil was producing roughly 3/4 of the entire world's coffee supply. The scale is almost hard to picture, a single country supplying most of a drink consumed on every continent. The 20th century brought instant coffee, invented in usable form in the early 1900s and mass-produced during both world wars to fuel soldiers on the front lines. Companies like Maxwell House and later Nescafé turned coffee into a household staple, marketed with the same relentless efficiency as any industrial product. What began as a ritual in Ethiopian highlands and Ottoman coffeehouses had become a multi-billion-dollar global commodity, traded on stock exchanges alongside oil and gold. Here is the part that should make you angry. Despite coffee generating well over $100 billion a year globally today, the farmers who grow it, many in Ethiopia, Colombia, Vietnam, and across Central America, often receive only a small fraction of the final retail price of a cup. Investigations into the coffee supply chain have repeatedly uncovered cases of child labor on plantations in several producing countries, along with farmers trapped in cycles of debt to middlemen who control access to global markets. The gap between a $5 café latte in a wealthy city and the wages of the person who harvested the beans remains one of the coffee industry's least discussed truths. Today. Today, coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world by some estimates, behind only oil. More than 2 billion cups are consumed globally every single day. Over 12 million hectares of land worldwide are dedicated to growing it, and more than 100 million people depend on the coffee trade for their livelihood in some form. It has become so embedded in daily life that most people never stop to ask where their morning cup actually came from, or what it cost to get there. That is the legacy of coffee. It is in your kitchen right now, sitting quietly in a bag or a jar, waiting to be brewed into another ordinary morning. But it was never really ordinary. It toppled a French monarchy, helped birth an independent Haiti, fueled a boycott that shaped early America, and today moves more money around the planet than almost anything else grown from soil. So the next time you lift that cup to your lips, remember Kaldi's goats on an Ethiopian hillside, the crowded coffeehouses of Istanbul and London, and a lawyer standing on a café table in Paris with a pistol in each hand. A tiny red seed did all of that. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which everyday object you think hides history like this. We will see you in the next one.